All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Unhooked. I'm your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz, and I am so excited today to bring on my dear friend Rich. Rich is someone who I met a couple years ago. We got introduced by a mutual friend who knew that we would connect, we would click, and Rich was kind enough to invite me onto his podcast and it talk about issues related to porn, and it's a beautiful podcast that I highly recommend you check out. Man Reimagined. And what I love about Rich is the kind of balanced and nuanced perspective on masculinity and what it means to be a man in today's society. And it's a topic that, as hopefully we're going to dive into today in this podcast, it's tricky to have this conversation, particularly in today's age where everything is very fiery. And so I just love how Rich is able to talk about these things in such a balanced way with a lot of wisdom and a lot of compassion. And I know that for you, the listeners out there, you're going to get tons of great insight from this conversation. So, Rich, I just want to welcome you to the show. Welcome.
Thank you for the extremely kind introduction. It's really nice to be here and connect with you again.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just your wisdom, your silky voice is just something that we had to have back on the podcast. It's it's the accent and the silkiness of it. So I know that you were gonna inspire a lot of people. And, just to digress a little bit more before we dive in, I was listening to a conversation you had with someone else, and you were talking about how you don't like the term role model anymore. And we could get into why you maybe don't like that term, but I do actually consider you as someone that is a very healthy role model, or a good example of what it means to be a man and how to balance, the masculine and feminine, how to talk about feelings and get in touch with your emotions. So I just really think that you're going to be a good example for a lot of the listeners out there today.
Again, thank you. I will try desperately to live up to that.
Yeah, no pressure. So, to start off with, starting where I just left off, masculinity does seem to be, in some ways, an almost controversial topic today. It's talking about masculinity is asking for, something. You're kind of putting a bullseye on your back from both sides in some ways. And I'm just curious, why do you think that is? What is it about this topic that is so controversial?
Where do we begin? I feel like what we're not doing so well as a society is kind of holding more than one idea at a time. Like, for example, women's struggles and women's rights. As much as, things are going well for them and they're expanding and it's an exciting time for them, and I fully love that, they're still experiencing lots of challenges. Roe versus Wade being reversed in America, just being one, of the million things that are currently post Me Too very alive. There's race, there's plenty of topics out there, LGBTQ. And so when men also put their hand up and say, we're not doing so great, or what about us, or in any way trying to also point out that men are struggling, and we are statistically, but I can go into it. It's almost like society is unable to hold like more than one idea at the same time. And that's a problem. The timing's not ideal, just because it feels like there's almost a reaction to it. And in some circles there are. I think that, what it means to be a man is a big question. I think also that men are kind of splintering into very sort of different factions, if you will. And the idea of even what men's work is really up in question. I'm involved in the European men's movement, and there's just no agreement there in kind of what way to go. You can contrast the European men's movement with how Americans, for example, like to go about it. And there's no right or wrong here. There's just like what's helpful and what's not. And who are we really talking to, and then where are we coming from? I feel like there's a reaction a lot of the time. There's a lot of burying our heads in the sand. And so when men do step up and try and say what they're thinking and feeling, it's just not always skillful. It's not always nuanced. And even if it is, it's not being well received because even if you do try and make a good point, there are a lot of, say, women, for example, that are just like kind of tired of hearing about it, or not ready to talk about it, because not women's fault, but as a society, we're just not very good at holding lots of ideas at the same time. There's a lot of stress going around. So I feel like I've opened a few cans of worms there, and over to you. Which one you want to dive
Yeah.
in?
Well, I'm curious what it is that calls you to this line of work. Like what happened in your life? Was there a moment or, an incident that happened that got you into maybe your own inner work or men's work and has brought you to this place?
The two different answers, I guess. If we zoom out and go back to why I got into the whole idea of inner work and found my way onto this path of self development and also trying to support and help others. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease back when I was 26. Um, I've managed to overcome and heal it complete, meaning I have no symptoms to this day, and I'm symptom free, medication free for like at least 10 years now. That was work to overcome that. What got me there was a sense of not really knowing who I was, being very frustrated in life, very angry, very depressed, not being in a job that in any way inspired me. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So that stress caused inflammation, caused this illness. And, I've spent many years learning about myself, learning about kind of healthy modalities and experimenting. There's no one path for everyone, but I've taken a fair amount of time to learn how to be healthier. Still a massive work in progress. And that took me to becoming one of the first Wim Hof method instructors in the world. I just got lucky in discovering it before it got really big and signing up for what was to be the first round of international instructors, and something else very interesting to people. And, God help you if you're a coach or a healer starting out today without some kind of very trendy, or hot kind of modality, because it's really hard to get out there. But for me, it was like red carpet in everywhere I went. So I'm very blessed that I sort of discovered that. Moving on and developing, growing, becoming a yoga instructor, getting involved in embodiment practices, and deepening my coaching, I found myself entering the field of men's work. A friend of mine, I think the first circle I actually joined was around the same time I discovered the Wim Hof method, because it was one of the sort of to be instructors that invited me along to a men's circle. And I thought, okay, it's a bunch of men that sit in a circle. I didn't realize it was a thing. Um, and that experience was actually quite full on. I can sort of share some weird stories about that, but it introduced me to the idea of men sitting around together and just kind of supporting each other. And for me, as I now understand myself to be a recovering nice guy, that felt much more comfortable around women than I did around men, especially men that expressed any sense of masculinity, healthy or not, because my own relationship was so corrupted to it. That made me kind of really uncomfortable. And so then learning, like, actually, it feels pretty good to be around men when it's done in a cool and safe way. And I found myself living in Bali and joining circles there, becoming good friends with the guy who ran it, who now is my co-presenter on the Man Reimagined podcast, and taking over the circle when he wasn't there, and really just coming to a place of like, my God, I've spent my whole life not wanting to be around men. It felt so uncomfortable. Now I've understood why. A lot of it had to do with the relationship to my father, my grandfather, that lineage, and also just kind of English men and sort of laddish culture. As a sensitive young boy, I really struggled with that. But learning what healthy masculinity actually meant and learning to embody that through the support of other men has been one of the most profound life-changing experiences. So if you think I look kind of or speak in any way in a balanced way about masculinity and femininity, like, God help you if you'd have met me before 2016, I would have been very negative about men, I think. So I'm really grateful that I've healed those wounds, and the relationship to my own father is like excellent now. And I can now offer other men an opportunity to do the same, because it changes the way that you relate to yourself, you relate to other men, show up in your relationships, as well as your kind of your career and how you actually get what you want without being a dick about it.
Um, I'd love for you to kind of talk about, you talked about maybe pre 2016 when you might have been a different person in terms of your relationship with men um, and what was different back then, like, because what strikes me is that for many people who have never been to a men's group or men's circle or done any kind of men's work at all, it's almost like that analogy of the water that you're swimming in that you don't know you're swimming in water because you've been swimming in it your whole life. And it's like, well, there's no concept that being in a circle with men and expressing your emotions or any of this men's work can even be important. And so I'd love for you to talk maybe first about what are the consequences of not having a healthy relationship with men?
Mm. I'll speak from experience in some of the men that I've worked with. But if we gravitate for whatever reason towards women predominantly, we feel safe around them because we're more sensitive, because we want to, we're good at expressing our emotions, or we feel like we need to do that. Then our relationships with them tend not to be always very healthy either in a kind of romantic sense. And then we start to need to talk about polarity. And when I talk about polarity, I'm not interested in like men behave in masculine and the women behave in the feminine. I think this is a really tired, outdated, and poorly understood and yet much talked about kind of concept of polarity. But I mean to say that these masculine traits of being able to say what you fucking want and think and lead yourself through life and not people please. Like, you learn that from being around other men, because typically men are very good at doing that. They're not so good at the kind of nurturing, empathetic, compassionate, kind of emotional intelligence spectrum side of things by and large. And so if you only hang around with men, you're good at doing that kind of thing. And if you are very good at hanging around with women, then you're going to miss out on those kind of skills. So for me and a lot of men that I know, it's that, well, yeah, I'm hanging around with women, but actually I want more from a lot of these relationships. And yet I haven't got the wherewithal, the courage to actually just say, hey, look, I actually really like you. Or if I do, then it gets way too late and I'm already friends. That's,
Mhm.
or just continually attracting and going for women that were emotionally unavailable, so that
Yeah.
they get something out of this dynamic. I give them a lot of attention without actually saying the thing that I want, which is more than just kind of being around them. And, a lot of people get caught up in this unhealthy relationship. And so that was kind of me for many years. And by hanging around more with men and talking about some of the skills of masculinity, if you will, and I wish we had other words for that. I wish we had other words for that, because it will just, so many people, when I talk about masculine skills or qualities, they start to associate them with being, uh, that there are things that men do and that, women might not, and vice versa for femininity. So this is a problem. And maybe we can open that discussion as to what these qualities are, but talk about them from a perspective of, we all have these qualities inside us. And yet typically how we're still raised in society, women tend to embody more of the feminine and tend to embody more of the masculine, but a healthy integration is learning to do both. And that's why I see women exploding right now through having much more opportunity through work, career, like women's empowerment. Like, they're learning to do a lot of this masculine self-leading stuff, so that they have this question of, what do I actually need a man for? And then in relationship, a lot of very tough women are kind of struggling to trust and let a man into their life. Like, what role do they actually play? Which is a really fair question. So if we pull that apart and go back to your original question, I would say that being around men helps me to feel less distracted by the feminine and actually more focused on my self, like my sense of direction, my purpose, and helps me not be so dependent and needing to be mothered often by the feminine, by women, because I never made that cut myself. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. One of the things that you've mentioned now a couple times, which I also really resonate in the work that you do, is talking about the nice guy syndrome, and this is something that definitely showed up in my life. It still shows up in my life, and it's something I'm working through. And I think a lot of the listeners can resonate with this, is wanting everyone to see you as a good person, not wanting to ruffle any feathers, always wanting to be not confrontational. And the consequences of that is you often don't speak up for what you want. You don't know how to express your needs or express when things aren't going how you want, and just to say, hey, I'm not okay with this. And so all this people pleasing, not really saying how you feel, what you want, um, is a problem. And I can definitely see that one of the benefits of these of men's groups and men's circles is having, good role models of how to actually do some of these things, how to speak up and say, this is what I want, how to be more, standing in your power. Um, I'm curious, what are some of the other kind of tangible benefits you've seen in your life after getting involved with men's work? Or what do you see from other people, maybe some of the people you work with, your clients?
There's a much clearer sense of self-worth. And it's uh, one of the most important things that we can have as human beings, yet alone as men. And if we distinguish self-esteem from self-worth, self-esteem is feeling good about yourself based on these external factors in the world, like achievements, like getting the girl, having a good body, getting a raise. But how do you feel when you don't get these things? Because you can't control these things, they don't always work out. Are you a friend to yourself when these things aren't going so well? Self-worth is that sense of I'm worth something, irrespective of how these other aspects in my life are going. I don't collapse. And being around other men, there's just, I don't know if you felt it being in a circle of men. Well, that doesn't mean sitting around a fire and taking our tops off and covering ourselves in war paint and fucking bellowing, chanting together. Like, it's fine. I'm sure there's value in doing that. I just mean just being around other men. There's something profound about it. And the practices of, say, presence that when you practice together, you take out into the real world. There's a really tangible benefit. Like, if we talk about the feminine as kind of chaos and distraction and movement, and it's there to entice us, and we can talk beyond gender about this. Like our practice, if we want to work on our masculinity, it's like training a simplicity of being present and not being distracted. And so being more disciplined, having a sense of impulse control, because you actually got the long game in sight. This is useful for women as well. It's beyond gender. I mean that. But when men come together, like there's just a feeling, I can't describe it, that is really appreciated. And then you can take that out. And so benefits of men's work, whether it's 6 weeks, whether it's 6 months, it's like, I want to connect to more men and I'm not afraid to. And I can look at another man in the eye and be like, how's it going, brother?
Yeah,
Simple thing, but it's missing. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of inferiority out there between us. And it's like, it's not necessary. And once you learn to hold yourself from a place of self-worth, it actually creates and breeds trust with another man. Because he's like, this man's got himself. I can trust that. I can relax.
yeah, and there's a sense of brotherhood, or just kind of being on the same team, as opposed to my experience for many years of when I come into the presence of another man, there's kind of this immediate almost fear or tension, like, do I need to prove myself? Is this an enemy? Is this someone I need to be on the lookout for? There's a combativeness almost that has nothing to do with the other person. It's just my own, the fear and insecurity of being someone who didn't have healthy male relationships or masculine friendships. And one of the benefits that I've seen is just that sense of, hey, we're in this together. We're on the same team. We're not alone here, and we can support each other, which is such a transformational shift in just my own sense of well-being when I'm around other men.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm happy you got to experience that. And guess what? Like any man that comes to a circle is more silent in his first moments because he's just trying to get his bearings. It's like, what is this? Am I safe here? Like there's a lot of energy in the room. Men give off that. it just, I don't know how to say or describe it or justify it. I don't want to. It's just like I experience it. And so a man's just finding his place in that. And then the moment he starts to clock that these other men aren't a threat and they're just open and checking in with what's going on about them in their lives. And it doesn't have to mean deep emotional breakdowns and like deep eye gazing and intimate hugging. Like that's, that's also not, there's various forms out there. Let's put it that way. That's a bit full on for a first event, right? But just being in that space and going, "Ah," and so many men in my experience come to that and go, wow, I didn't know so many people felt the same way as I did about so many subjects. I didn't realize it was okay to feel these things as well. So like the
Yeah.
key point that you mentioned was we just didn't have healthy role models, and most of our parents didn't have healthy role models. Like there's many reasons for that. Can talk about that, going back to the last couple of world wars and traditional roles and everything kind of changing like in the last 50, 60 years dramatically. And so there's so many kind of questions that men face and so many roles that women are taking on, which is great. But men are just in that space of what's going on here. And that kind of not knowingness gets passed down. And so a lot of men tend to just not say anything at all and repress their emotions. And there's statistics out there to show that, the current batch of, what was it, millennials, I can't keep up with these phrases, but between sort of like 18 and 35, like men in Germany, boys, we should really say, especially the younger ones, they do suppress their emotions. They do, if they get ill, they don't say anything because they'll assume this thing will get better on its own. There's such a tendency throughout time with men to not express that there's something wrong because that can be perceived as a sign of weakness. And that's one of the most ridiculous, fucked up things. And yet there's a very good reason for that. Right. And so when we start to be expectations, roles, etc., so when we start to dissolve these roles, we start to talk about, what does being a man mean for you? What does masculinity look like in your life? And I like to talk about like a spectrum of masculine and feminine skills that kind of have opposites. And where do you find yourself on the spectrum? Are you playing kind of notes that are kind of more feminine, typically like a sensitive, nice guy like me? Great. Well, what about these notes over here? Do you reckon you could learn to play some of them? And how would that help you in your life? Not to abandon an aspect of you, not to behave like some kind of ideal, but just to learn to play more keys because it just sounds nicer,
Hmm.
and that will help you in life.
Yeah. You mentioned, like the millennials, younger, boys really just feel unable to express themselves and maybe they don't have any